The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the worst snowstorm our neighborhood had seen in about 15 years. I remember standing at my front door in my boots and heavy coat, watching the snow come down in thick curtains while I held the envelope, and I thought to myself, who in the world sends a formal letter during a blizzard? I ripped it open right there on my front porch, snowflakes landing on the paper, and I read the first line twice because I genuinely could not believe it. It was a violation notice from the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, and the violation in question was that I had placed two 50-pound bags of ice melt salt on my front porch, leaning against the wall next to my front door, and apparently that was a problem. Not a small note, not a friendly knock, not a "Hey David, could you maybe move those?" No. A formal violation notice with a proposed fine of $150, and the name at the bottom of the notice was Janet Hollister, HOA Compliance Director. I want you to understand something about those salt bags. It was February in the Midwest. We had already gotten about 2 feet of snow that season, and the forecast for that week alone was calling for another 14 inches. My driveway was a sheet of ice every single morning. My front walk was treacherous. My elderly neighbor across the street had already slipped on his own front steps twice that winter, and I was not about to let the same thing happen to me or anyone who came to my door. So yes, I had bought 2 large bags of ice melt from the hardware store, and yes, I had placed them right next to my front door where I could grab them quickly every morning before heading out to salt my walk and my driveway. That was not laziness or sloppiness. That was pure, practical, sensible winter preparedness. Those bags weighed 50 pounds each. You do not want to be hauling 100 pounds of salt up from a basement or a garage every morning when it is 12 degrees outside, and you are already running late for work. But apparently, Janet Hollister had driven past my house, seen those bags sitting next to my front door, and decided that they were an eyesore that violated the community aesthetic standards of Maplewood Ridge. And so, in the middle of a blizzard, I was being threatened with a $150 fine. I went inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table to read the full violation notice. Janet had cited Section 7, subsection C of the Maplewood Ridge HOA Covenant, which stated that homeowners were prohibited from storing, quote, unsightly materials, equipment, or supplies on the front exterior of any home in a manner that is visible from the street and detracts from the aesthetic standards of the community. She had also attached a photograph that she had apparently taken from her car. You could see my front porch in the picture, the 2 salt bags leaning against the wall, and about 3 feet of snow on the ground in front of my house. She had circled the salt bags in red marker. Actual red marker on a printed photograph, like she was a detective who had just cracked a major case. I put the letter down and started laughing, because what else do you do? Then I stopped laughing and started thinking, because I knew Janet Hollister well enough by then to know that she was serious. She was always serious. Janet was the kind of person who had decided somewhere along the line that being on the HOA board gave her power over other people, and she had leaned into that role with a level of enthusiasm that would have been better directed at literally anything else. She was meticulous, she was persistent, and she had a documented history in our neighborhood of using the HOA rules in ways that felt a lot more like personal vendettas than genuine community governance. I had watched her do it to other people before. She had fined the Garcias on Birchwood Lane for having a garden gnome that she deemed too whimsical for community standards. She had gone after the Petersons for parking their truck in their own driveway in a way she claimed was too close to the property line. She had tried to fine old Mr. Hannigan for putting up Christmas lights in what she called an unauthorized color scheme. Every single time she had the same approach: formal notice, referenced violation, proposed fine, and a tight deadline to either pay or dispute, knowing that most people would just pay rather than deal with the hassle. The problem for Janet was that I was not most people. I had been a paralegal for 11 years before I switched careers and started my own small contracting business. I knew how to read a document, I knew how to look up rules and precedents, and I knew that the best defense against someone like Janet was thorough, documented, patient preparation. So instead of paying the fine or panicking, I sat down with the full HOA covenant document, which I had actually kept in a folder in my filing cabinet since the day I bought the house, and I started reading. Section 7, subsection C, she had cited it accurately enough in terms of the language. Unsightly materials, equipment, or supplies stored visibly on the front exterior. But the covenant also had a Section 7, subsection F, which was what I really wanted, and it said that enforcement of aesthetic standards must take into account reasonable seasonal and safety-related necessity, and that no homeowner shall be penalized for taking reasonable safety precautions required by documented seasonal hazard conditions. That language was in there because, years before I bought my house, there had apparently been a dispute over someone storing a generator on their front porch during a winter storm, and the resulting legal back and forth had led to that exception clause being written into the covenant. Janet had cited subsection C. She had conveniently not mentioned subsection F. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. I took photos of the snow on my driveway, the ice on my front walk, the general state of the neighborhood. I took photos of the weather forecast on my phone showing the upcoming 14 inches. I took a screenshot of the temperature, which was currently 11 degrees Fahrenheit. I found the County Road Commission's official winter hazard advisory for our county, which had been issued 2 days earlier and specifically warned residents to take precautions against ice-related falls on residential walkways. I saved all of it. Then I sat down and wrote a formal response to Janet's violation notice. The response was polite but detailed. I cited Section 7, subsection F in full. I explained the weight of the salt bags and the daily necessity of having them accessible. I attached the weather forecast, the county hazard advisory, and my photos of the ice conditions. I noted that the HOA covenant explicitly recognized that safety-related seasonal necessity was a valid exception to aesthetic enforcement, and I stated clearly that I would not be paying the fine. I also requested, formally and in writing, that the HOA provide a written response within 10 business days, as required by the dispute resolution procedures in Section 14 of the covenant. I sent the letter via certified mail and also emailed it to the general HOA contact address. Then I went back outside and salted my driveway because it was still snowing and someone had to do it. For a few days, nothing happened. The snow kept coming. I kept salting my driveway and my front walk, and every morning I was grateful those bags were right there next to my front door. My neighbor Tom, who lived 2 houses down, had slipped and sprained his wrist trying to carry a bag of salt from his garage in the dark one morning, and that just reinforced for me how genuinely useful it was to have the stuff accessible. I mentioned my situation to Tom while he was standing in my driveway with his wrist wrapped up, and his reaction was basically what I expected. Blank disbelief followed by the word seriously. Tom had his own history with Janet, nothing as dramatic as mine, but enough to give him the general picture. He told me that at the last HOA meeting, which I had not attended because it had been rescheduled 3 times and eventually held on a night when I had a work commitment, Janet had apparently spent 40 minutes discussing what she called the deteriorating aesthetic standards of the north end of the neighborhood. The north end was where I lived. Tom said she had been vague about specifics, but the general tone was that she was building towards something. He said he wished he had warned me sooner. I told him not to worry about it, I had it handled. But I also started paying closer attention to what else was going on in the neighborhood, because whenever Janet started moving, it was rarely just one thing at a time. Sure enough, about 4 days after I sent my formal response, I found out that Janet had also sent violation notices to two other homeowners on my street. One was to Maria Chen, who had a small outdoor mat in front of her door that Janet claimed was non-standard. The other was to Rick Delgado, who had left a snow shovel leaning against his garage exterior. A snow shovel, in February, in a snowstorm. The man had put his shovel down for 5 minutes and Janet had photographed it and sent him a formal violation notice. I knocked on Maria's door that evening. She opened it looking flustered, and I showed her my violation notice and told her about Rick's. Her eyes went wide. She said she had been trying to figure out if she was required to pay the fine or if she had any options. I told her she had plenty of options, starting with Section 7, Subsection F, and Section 14's dispute procedures. I told her I would help her draft her response. She invited me in and we sat at her kitchen table for an hour going through the covenant together. Then I went to Rick's house and did the same thing. Rick was furious. He had lived in Maplewood Ridge for 12 years and had never had a single violation notice before. And the idea that leaving a snow shovel outside for a few minutes was somehow a finable offense had him genuinely fuming. By the end of that week, all three of us had filed formal dispute responses, all citing Section 7, Subsection F, all requesting written HOA responses within the required 10 business days. I also sent a separate letter directly to the full HOA board, not just Janet, informing them that multiple homeowners on the north end of the neighborhood had received violation notices for what were clearly winter safety items, and that we intended to pursue the dispute process fully if the fines were not withdrawn. The HOA board had 5 members. Janet was one of them, the compliance director. The board president was a man named Gerald Webb, who I had met exactly twice, and who struck me as the kind of person who wanted the title of board president without any of the actual work or conflict that came with it. The other 3 members were varying degrees of uninvolved. The board's general approach seemed to be to let Janet do whatever she wanted in the compliance space and stay out of her way. That approach was about to get a lot more complicated for all of them. Gerald called me on a Thursday evening. His voice had that careful, measured tone of someone who was trying to sound in control of a situation he was not entirely sure he was in control of. He said he had received my letter and wanted to talk about the situation informally before things escalated. I said I was happy to talk, but that I wanted it on record that we were having this conversation in response to my formal dispute filing. He said that was fine. Then he said, and I am paraphrasing here but only slightly, that he thought it might be best if I just relocated the salt bags to somewhere less visible, like my side yard or my garage, and that the HOA would be willing to drop the fine as a gesture of goodwill. I told Gerald, very politely, that I appreciated the offer but that I was not going to rearrange my winter safety preparations based on Janet's aesthetic preferences, and that the covenant's own language in Section 7, Subsection F, clearly supported my position. I told him that if the HOA wanted to resolve this cleanly, the path forward was to formally withdraw the violation notices for me, Maria, and Rick, issue a written clarification that winter safety items were covered by the seasonal necessity exception, and acknowledge that the enforcement action had been inconsistent with the covenant. Gerald went quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need to consult with the rest of the board. I said that sounded great and that I looked forward to their written response within the 10 business day window. Then I said goodbye and hung up. The thing about dealing with people like Janet is that they count on everyone else just giving in. They send the scary formal letter, they cite the official rule, they impose the fine, and most people, faced with the hassle and the implied authority, just pay and move on. Janet had almost certainly counted on me doing exactly that. What she had not counted on was that I had actually read the covenant, that I knew which exceptions applied, and that I was, at this point, genuinely annoyed enough to see this through to the end. I started asking around the neighborhood more broadly. Not just Tom and Maria and Rick, but people on other streets, people who had been in Maplewood Ridge longer than me. What I found was illuminating. Janet had issued at least 14 violation notices in the past 18 months. Of those, 11 had resulted in homeowners paying fines rather than disputing them. The 3 who had disputed had all eventually had their notices withdrawn, but only after significant stress and back and forth. Not a single violation notice issued by Janet in 18 months had ever gone to a full board hearing. She was operating in a zone where her say-so was essentially final, because nobody pushed back hard enough to force the formal process. I also found out something else, something that one of the longer-tenured neighbors, a woman named Carol Hutchins who had lived in Maplewood Ridge since the development was built, told me over her kitchen counter with a cup of tea in her hand and a very specific look on her face. She told me that the HOA had a fine collection account, and that fine revenues were supposed to be logged in the HOA's financial statements and reported to homeowners annually. She told me that the last 2 annual financial reports had shown dramatically lower fine revenue than what she estimated had actually been collected, based on conversations with neighbors who had paid fines. She said she had brought this up at a board meeting once and been essentially brushed off by Gerald, who had said the discrepancy was probably just a record-keeping timing issue. I asked Carol how she knew what fines had been paid. She smiled and said she ran the neighborhood Facebook group, which meant that when someone was upset enough to post about getting an HOA fine, she saw it. She had started keeping a list informally, just because the pattern bothered her. She showed me the list on her phone. There were 22 fines paid by her count over the past 18 months. The financial report showed 7. That changed things significantly. That was not an overzealous HOA board member being annoying about salt bags. If that discrepancy was accurate, that was potentially misappropriation of funds. That was potentially a real financial crime. I told Carol to hold onto that list and not to post anything publicly yet because I needed to think about how to approach this carefully. She agreed and she gave me a copy of the list. I sat with that information for a couple of days. I kept salting my driveway. The snow kept coming. The temperature dropped to 6 degrees one night, which was the kind of cold that makes your car groan when it starts and turns any untreated surface into a genuine hazard. I was very glad my salt bags were exactly where they were. I also thought about the security camera situation. I had a doorbell camera and 2 additional cameras mounted on my house, one covering the driveway and one covering the side of the house. I had installed them 2 summers ago after a string of package thefts in the area. One of those cameras, the driveway camera, had a wide enough angle that it captured a good portion of the street in front of my house. I had not thought much about it in the context of this situation until I rewatched the footage from the morning Janet had apparently photographed my salt bags. There she was. Janet Hollister in her silver sedan slowing down in front of my house. She stopped the car in the middle of the street, which given the snow conditions was a genuinely dangerous thing to do, and she got out of the car in a coat and boots, walked partway up toward my house, took a photo with her phone, walked back to her car, got in and drove off. The whole thing took about 90 seconds. What was interesting was the timestamp. It was 6:47 in the morning. She had been doing this on purpose, early in the morning, presumably when she thought nobody would notice. I saved the footage to an external drive immediately. The 10-business-day window was ticking down. On day 8, I got a written response from the HOA board, signed by Gerald Webb. It was, to put it diplomatically, not what I had asked for. It acknowledged my citation of Section 7, subsection F, but argued that the board had reviewed the matter and determined that the salt bags did not qualify as safety equipment within the meaning of that section because, and this was the part that made me put the letter down and take a breath, ice melt salt was a consumable supply and not a safety device per se, and therefore the seasonal safety exception did not apply. They also noted that the violation notices for Maria and Rick were separate matters that would be addressed separately. The fine stood. I called Maria and Rick that evening. They had received similar letters. We agreed that we were not going to pay. We also agreed that it was time to push this to the next level, which under the covenant meant requesting a formal hearing before the full board. Each of us filed a hearing request within the next 2 days. Under Section 14, the board was required to schedule a hearing within 30 days. While we waited for the hearing date, I did a few things. First, I contacted a local attorney friend of mine named Susan Park, who specialized in property and HOA law. I explained the situation, the fines, the covenant language, and the potential financial discrepancy Carol had identified. Susan's reaction to the salt bag fines was a long pause followed by the words, "That's genuinely absurd, David," but she immediately got serious when I mentioned the financial discrepancy. She asked me to send her everything: the covenant, Carol's list, the HOA financial reports, all of it. I sent it that same evening. Second, I reached out to more neighbors. Not just the ones who had been fined, but anyone who I thought might have relevant information or who might want to come to the board hearing to show community support. The response was better than I expected. Tom said he was in. Maria was bringing her sister, who was a paralegal. Carol said she would be there with her list. Rick said he was bringing his brother-in-law, who he described as, quote, "a guy who really knows how to sit in a room and make people uncomfortable." I chose not to ask for more details on that one. Third, I went back to the camera footage and spent an evening going through 3 weeks of recordings. What I found was that Janet had driven slowly past my house, or stopped briefly in front of it, 7 times in the 3 weeks leading up to the violation notice. 7 times. She had clearly been building a case, or at least trying to, before she sent the letter. That was not routine compliance patrol. That was targeted. Susan called me back on a Friday afternoon with a preliminary read on the financial discrepancy. She said that based on what Carol's list showed versus what the financial reports disclosed, there was a potential shortfall of somewhere between $4,000 and $7,000 over 18 months. She said it was not definitive without a full audit and access to the actual fine collection records, but she said it was concerning enough that she wanted to know how the fine money was collected and who had direct access to those funds. She also said that if the shortfall was real and intentional, it could constitute embezzlement. I asked her about the best way to proceed. She said the smart move was to first get through the board hearing and see how the board responded, then use the outcome there to determine whether to escalate to a financial audit request, which homeowners had the right to demand under the HOA's governing documents, and potentially a complaint to the state attorney general's office if the numbers supported it. She said she wanted to attend the hearing with me if I was okay with that. I said absolutely yes. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in the middle of February in the community room of our neighborhood clubhouse. It was, predictably, snowing again. The parking lot outside the clubhouse had been plowed, but the walking path to the door was still icy, and I noticed with no small amount of satisfaction that whoever was responsible for maintaining the clubhouse grounds had not salted that path. People were slipping and shuffling carefully toward the door, and I made a mental note to point that out if the opportunity arose. I got there early. Susan was already there, in a dark coat with a briefcase, looking exactly like someone who knew what she was doing. Maria arrived with her sister. Rick arrived with his imposing brother-in-law, whose name turned out to be Victor, and who was indeed a large, quiet man who had the kind of resting face that suggested he had heard everything and found very little of it impressive. Tom arrived. Carol arrived with her printed list in a folder. A few other neighbors who had been following the situation through the Facebook group showed up as well. By the time the meeting was called to order, there were about 20 homeowners in the room, which I could tell made Gerald Webb visibly uneasy. Janet was there, sitting at the board table, in a blazer that suggested she took this setting very seriously. She had a folder in front of her. She looked completely composed, which either meant she had no idea what was about to happen or she was a better actor than I had given her credit for. Gerald opened the meeting with some procedural comments about how the hearing would work, and then he introduced the first matter, which was my violation and dispute. He gave a brief summary of the violation, and then said the floor was open for me to present my case. I stood up, thanked the board, and walked through it methodically. I cited Section 7, subsection F, and its exact language. I explained the weight of the bags and the daily safety necessity. I presented the weather documentation, the county hazard advisory, and the temperature records. I put the photos of my icy driveway up on the screen using a laptop I had brought. I cited a legal precedent Susan had found from a neighboring county where an HOA had attempted similar enforcement of aesthetic standards over winter safety items and had lost in small claims court. Then I presented the camera footage. I played the clip of Janet stopping her car in front of my house at 6:47 in the morning, getting out, photographing my front porch, and leaving. There was a general murmur in the room. Janet's composure slipped just slightly. I said that I was presenting this not as an accusation, but as context, demonstrating that the enforcement action had been specifically targeted at my property over a period of time before the notice was issued. Gerald looked at Janet. Janet looked at the table in front of her. Then she looked up and said, in a voice that was impressively steady given the circumstances, that her job as compliance director required her to document potential violations, and that there was nothing inappropriate about her monitoring properties in the community. She said the salt bags were clearly visible from the street and clearly fell under Section 7, subsection C. Susan stood up at that point and introduced herself as my legal representative. She asked, very politely, whether the board had given consideration to the seasonal safety exception in subsection F, and whether the board's written determination that ice melt salt was not safety equipment within the meaning of that section was a legal determination or a lay interpretation. Gerald said it was the board's reasonable interpretation of the covenant language. Susan said that was interesting, and then she cited the small claims court precedent I had mentioned and added 2 more cases she had found, both of which had held that ice melt products used to prevent slip-and-fall hazards were unambiguously safety-related and fell within seasonal safety exceptions in HOA covenants. She put printed copies of the case summaries on the board table. Janet leaned forward and said that those cases were from other jurisdictions and might not apply here. Susan said that was technically true, but that they were highly persuasive, and that any small claims court judge in this county would almost certainly follow the same reasoning, especially given the county hazard advisory I had documented. She then said, very calmly, that she would be filing in small claims court within 5 business days if the fines for all 3 homeowners were not formally withdrawn tonight. Gerald looked deeply uncomfortable. 2 of the other board members were whispering to each other. The third was looking at the ceiling in a way that suggested he was mentally already somewhere else. Janet looked like she was calculating something. Then Carol stood up. She said she had something she needed to bring to the board's attention that went beyond the violation dispute. She introduced herself, noted that she had been a Maplewood Ridge homeowner for 17 years, and then she walked the board through her list of fines paid by neighbors versus what was disclosed in the financial reports. She was careful, specific, and completely calm. She said she was not making any formal accusations, but that she was requesting, on behalf of herself and several other homeowners, that the board authorize an independent financial audit of the HOA's fine collection account. The room got very quiet. Gerald started to say something about record-keeping discrepancies and timing differences. Carol said, still calmly, that she had spoken with a certified public accountant who had reviewed the numbers she had compiled, and that the accountant had described the discrepancy as, quote, not consistent with a record-keeping timing issue. She put a copy of the accountant's preliminary assessment on the board table. Janet stood up and said that she found it highly inappropriate for a homeowner to bring what amounted to unverified allegations to a public meeting without first going through proper channels. Carol said she had attempted to raise this concern at a board meeting 14 months ago and had been dismissed. She had the meeting minutes to prove it. She put a copy of those meeting minutes on the board table as well. One of the quieter board members, a woman named Patricia, looked at Gerald and said quietly that she thought they needed to pause and consult with an attorney before continuing. Gerald nodded, looking like a man who had just realized the ground under his feet was significantly less stable than he had thought. He announced a brief recess. During the recess, I stood near the refreshment table with Susan and Tom. Tom was eating a cookie with the calm satisfaction of someone watching a movie that was going exactly as hoped. Susan said things were going very well. She also said, quietly, that if the financial discrepancy held up under a real audit, this was likely going to involve law enforcement at some point. When the hearing reconvened, Gerald announced that the board was withdrawing the violation notices for me, Maria, and Rick effective immediately. He said the board acknowledged that winter safety preparedness items fell within the seasonal necessity exception of the covenant, and that going forward, the compliance guidelines would be clarified in writing to reflect that. There was applause from the neighbors in the room. Janet sat very still and said nothing. Then Gerald announced that the board was authorizing an independent audit of the fine collection account to be conducted by a certified public accounting firm, with results to be reported to all homeowners. He said the board took its financial responsibility to the community seriously and wanted to ensure full transparency. His voice had the slightly hollow tone of someone who was saying the right words, but was not entirely sure why this was happening to him on a Wednesday evening in February. After the meeting, people milled around for a while. Several neighbors came up to me and thanked me. A few said they wished they had pushed back on their own violations instead of just paying. Maria's sister clapped me on the shoulder and said I had done excellent work. Victor, Rick's brother-in-law, shook my hand and said, in the most words I had heard him say all evening, that it was good to see someone stand up to that kind of nonsense. Carol looked satisfied in the quiet way of someone who had been waiting patiently for something for a long time. Janet left without speaking to anyone. She was in her car and gone before most of the neighbors had even put their coats on. The audit took about 6 weeks. The accounting firm the board hired was thorough and professional. Susan had also quietly recommended them based on her knowledge of who did solid HOA financial work in our area, and the board had gone along with the suggestion, probably because at that point Gerald was not in a position to argue about much. The results came back in mid-March, when the last of the season's snow was finally starting to melt, and the ice that had covered everything for 3 months was giving way to cold mud and the first pale hints of spring. The audit found a discrepancy of $6,240 over 22 months. It was not a record-keeping timing issue. The audit traced the discrepancy to the fine collection process, in which fines were accepted in cash or check made out to a general HOA compliance account, and where the documentation chain had a significant gap between payments received and payments deposited. The accounting firm flagged the gap and noted that the access controls on the compliance account were insufficient, and that there was one individual with both collection and deposit authority over that account. That individual was Janet Hollister. The audit report went to the full board and, per the HOA's governing documents, to all homeowners. Susan said the report was essentially a gift-wrapped referral for law enforcement. She said the board had an obligation to report the findings, and that if they did not, homeowners could report directly. As it turned out, the board did report, probably because at this point Gerald and the other members were sufficiently alarmed about their own liability if they sat on it. 2 police detectives came to the neighborhood about 10 days after the audit report was released. I know this partly because Carol told me, and partly because I saw an unmarked car parked in front of the clubhouse for about 3 hours one afternoon. Susan told me the detectives had been given a full copy of the audit and the supporting documentation. The investigation moved at the pace that financial investigations typically move, which is to say not quickly, but it moved. Janet was charged with misappropriation of funds in early April. The charge was a felony given the amount involved. The story made the local news, which was how most people in the broader area found out about it. The headline was something about an HOA compliance director being charged in connection with a fine collection scheme, and the local news station used a file photo of suburban homes in snow that I was reasonably sure was not even our neighborhood, but the overall picture was accurate enough. Several neighbors texted me when the story ran. Tom sent me a gif of someone doing a victory dance, which I appreciated. Janet stepped down from the HOA board the same day the charges were filed. Gerald also announced, quietly, that he would not be seeking re-election at the annual HOA meeting in the spring. 2 of the other board members followed suit. The entire composition of the HOA board effectively turned over, which created a vacancy situation that needed to be addressed through a special election. A lot of people encouraged me to run for the board. Carol told me I should. Maria said she would vote for me. Tom said he would campaign for me, which mostly seemed to involve him mentioning it to people at the mailbox and at the hardware store. I thought about it for a while. I was not sure I wanted to spend my evenings in committee meetings when I could be running my contracting business or doing literally anything else. But I also thought about the fact that the best way to make sure what had happened under Janet and Gerald did not happen again was to put people on that board who actually understood the covenant, understood their responsibilities, and were going to use the role to serve the community rather than themselves. I ran. Carol ran. Maria's sister, whose name was Angela and who had proven at the hearing that she knew her way around a governing document, agreed to run as well. All 3 of us were elected at the special election in late April, along with 2 other homeowners who were genuinely good people and who had also had enough of the old guard's approach. Victor, Rick's brother-in-law, was elected as well, which delighted Rick and mildly intimidated everyone else, though in a good way. One of the first things the new board did was issue a written clarification to the community stating that seasonal safety items, including ice melt products, snow removal tools, and winter safety equipment, were explicitly covered by the seasonal necessity exception in the covenant and would not be subject to aesthetic compliance enforcement. We framed it, had it mailed to every homeowner, and posted it on the community website. It was 3 paragraphs long, completely clear, and took approximately 45 minutes to draft and approve, which I noted was a significantly more efficient use of board meeting time than Janet had apparently managed in years. We also rewrote the fine collection procedures entirely. All fines now had to be paid directly to the HOA's main financial account by check or electronic transfer only, no cash, and no single board member had both collection and deposit authority. The accountant the board retained going forward was the same firm that had done the audit, and they did quarterly reviews. Full financial reports went out to all homeowners twice a year instead of once, with a detailed line-item breakdown. Janet's case moved through the legal system over the following months. She accepted a plea agreement in the fall that required her to make full restitution of the $6,240, perform community service, and served a period of probation. She did not go to prison, which some neighbors felt was too lenient, but the restitution meant that every dollar she had taken was returned to the HOA account, and the conviction meant it was a matter of permanent public record. The community voted to use the restituted funds to repave the clubhouse parking lot and salt the walking path properly for winter, which I thought was an elegant use of the money. I ran into Janet once after everything was settled, at the grocery store of all places. It was a Saturday in late October, and I was in the canned goods aisle. She was at the far end, and we made eye contact for exactly 1 second before we both looked away and headed in opposite directions. There was nothing to say. Everything had already been said, in formal notices and legal filings and a courtroom, and the outcome had been what it was. I was not angry at that point. I was just done with it. The following winter was much calmer. The new board's clarification letter meant that nobody was stressed about their salt bags, or their snow shovels, or their outdoor mats. I put my two 50-pound bags of ice melt right next to my front door again on the first really cold day of December, same as the year before, and I did it with a small, quiet satisfaction that I will not pretend was entirely about the practical convenience of having them close at hand. Tom walked by while I was positioning them and gave me a thumbs up. I waved back. The neighborhood felt different. Not dramatically different, not like some movie transformation where everything suddenly becomes perfect and sunny, just noticeably calmer. When people saw each other at mailboxes or in driveways, there was less of that wary, careful quality to the conversation, the sense that someone might be taking notes. The Facebook group Carol ran was back to being mostly people asking for contractor recommendations and trading news about road conditions, and occasionally arguing about whether the new pizza place on Route 12 was actually good or just convenient, which is the kind of neighborhood discourse that is completely fine and appropriate. The HOA board meetings were shorter. Agenda items were specific and practical. Minutes were published within a week. Financial reports were posted on the website. Nobody was being followed by a silver sedan at 6:47 in the morning. I thought sometimes about how the whole thing had started. A couple of bags of salt on a porch. A violation notice in a snowstorm. Janet in her blazer with her red marker, convinced she had found something worth making a federal case about. She had been right that she found something, just not in the way she had intended. Pulling on that thread had unraveled a whole pattern of behavior that the community had been living with for years without fully seeing it. And once it was seen and named and documented, it could not be unseen. That is the thing about HOA overreach that I think a lot of people do not fully appreciate until they are in the middle of it. The rules are real. The covenant is a real legal document. The HOA has real authority over certain things. But that authority only functions properly when the people wielding it are genuinely trying to serve the community rather than themselves, and when homeowners know their rights well enough to push back when someone crosses the line. The moment Janet sent me that violation notice for 2 bags of salt in a blizzard, she was counting on me not knowing my rights. She had been counting on that with every homeowner she had targeted. The difference was that this time she was wrong. I finished salting my driveway that December morning, put the scoop back in the bag, left the bag right where it was next to the front door, and went inside to make coffee. Through the kitchen window I could see the snow coming down in the gray light, covering the rooftops and the parked cars and the bare trees. The street was quiet. Everything was still and white and cold, the way winter mornings in our neighborhood always were, and there was nothing out of the ordinary to see. Just houses and snow and the quiet normal life of people who were finally left alone to live it. It had taken 2 salt bags, a blizzard, a certified letter, a hearing, a financial audit, a police investigation, a board election, and most of a calendar year to get there. But there we were. Rick texted me that morning around 8 o'clock. It just said, "Salt bags still out front." I texted back a photo of mine, right where they always were, leaning against the wall next to my front door in plain sight of the street. He sent back a photo of his snow shovel, leaning against his garage, also in plain sight. Maria sent a photo of her outdoor mat, still in front of her door, the corners slightly dusted with snow. I put my phone down and drank my coffee and watched the snow fall. Some things are worth standing up for, even when they seem small. Especially when they seem small. because it is usually the small things that tell you everything you need to know about whether the people in charge are using their authority to serve you or to control you. 2 bags of salt on a front porch in winter are not an eyesore. They are just a man being practical about the ice on his driveway, trying to get through February without anyone slipping, which is the most reasonable and ordinary thing in the world. The moment someone in a position of authority tells you that is a problem worth fining you for, you have learned something important about what kind of authority they actually intend to exercise. I learned it. I did something about it. And the neighborhood was better for it, which was all I had ever wanted from the beginning. The snow kept falling. The salt bag stayed put. And Maplewood Ridge, for the first time in a long time, was genuinely at peace.